All right, Alexander, let's talk about the phone call between Biden and Zelensky. And the first thing I want to say is you have to release the transcript. They have to release the transcript in reference of the way they went after Trump with release the transcript. But anyway, what a comedy this has become.
Yeah.
I mean, this has become a true comedy. And
Yes.
I always say this with the sentiment and the fear that, some idiot in some neocon war hawk idiot in the State Department could hijack this and turn it into a war, or the Pentagon, or some idiot in Kiev war hawk neocon idiot could hijack this and turn this into a war as well. But saying all of that, this has really become a freaking ridiculous wag the dog comedy. And I think we have been right from the get-go.
Absolutely, we have been right. And can I just say, I think more and more people are now gradually coming round to that view. There was even an article in The Guardian by a man called Simon Tisdall, who, by the way, I disagree with on everything. But he started finally to accept that this is a phony war, though he blamed it on Putin, which is ridiculous. But this must have been one of the most extraordinary telephone calls ever to happen between a US president and someone else. I mean, it is, we now really are, as you rightly say, into Hollywood fiction. I mean, we all remember the Wag the Dog film of the late 1990s. I mean, we are, as David Stockman has, Ronald Reagan's former budget manager, he's actually pointed out, we're now actually living through it in real time, only with immeasurably more dangerous stakes than, of course, was the case in that film. Anyway, let's just talk about this, because, of course, we've had all these muddled discussions, the CNN coming, giving us one account of what happened over the course of the call, and then retracting it, and then publishing another article which basically says what the first one says. And we've got all sorts of commentaries coming out of Ukraine itself, and we've had things from Julia Ioffe, this US journalist, who was previously, by the way, I think she was the New York Times' correspondent in Moscow. She was some big mainstream US media outlets correspondent in Moscow. But anyway, we can piece it all together, it seems to me, with a great deal of confidence as a result of what everybody is now saying, what actually happened. And it is clear that Zelensky and Biden had last Thursday an almighty, furious row. And we hear words like descriptions of, Biden yelling at Zelensky and Zelensky telling Biden to calm down. Now, that's the last part of it has been slightly, well, they've tried to make out that, Zelensky said, calm down about the whole situation. But I think when you hear words like calm down being thrown around, it clearly is Zelensky on the receiving end of Biden's anger and telling Biden to calm down. And we hear stories about Biden telling Zelensky that an attack on Ukraine can happen at any moment, and Zelensky pushing strongly back on that, and Biden telling Zelensky apparently that if there is a war, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is going to be sacked by the Russians, and Zelensky again pushing back on that too. Now, these are obviously disputed accounts of the call, but for the record, I believe they are accurate, and I believe that they accurately reflect what happened over the course of that call. Now, the Ukrainians are sticking to their positions. They're continuing to say that they see no sign of a Russian attack on their country. So we have the extraordinary picture of the Ukrainians denying that they are under attack or threatened with attack, the Americans insisting to them that they are, and the President of the United States, no less, trying to bully the President of Ukraine in order to get the President of Ukraine to admit that his country is subject to an imminent attack. Now, all that tells me every single part of that tells me that we're dealing with a concocted story, and that the government in Washington, the administration in Washington, is becoming increasingly alarmed that the Ukrainians are refusing to play their designated role in this story. And as a result, the Americans are becoming, or at least the administration is becoming, and the president himself is becoming incredibly angry with the Ukrainians. And in order to back that up, we've had this report from Julia Yoffe, who, as I said, is this journalist from in the United States, well connected to the Democrats, and she says that the administration and the Democrats have had it up to there, as she put it, in these inelegant words, with Zelensky. They consider him unreliable and unsatisfactory. Clearly, as I said, because he's not following their narrative and their frustration with him. This is the Democrats. I mean, she specifically says the Democrats, with their frustration with him, is starting to boil over.
All right. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions now, quick questions, because I have a lot on my mind with this. But here we go. I agree with you that I think Biden did say those things to Zelensky. My question to you is, and the reason I agree with you, and it's kind of a question, is because this is exactly the way Biden does talk, isn't it? I can see Biden using the words, they're going to sack Kiev and, brace for impact or prepare for impact. I mean, it is exactly in tone with the Biden we have seen over the last year, correct?
Absolutely. And I would add, it also, one of the things we've also seen about the Biden over the last year is that this man has a very short temper. He gets incredibly angry very fast. So it completely consistent with what we know of Biden's personality and the figures of speech he uses.
Great. Biden is treating Zelensky like this and treating Ukraine like this because Biden at one point in time under Obama was running Ukraine. Yeah. And Biden, along with the people around Biden, believe that Ukraine is their poodle, their lapdog, and they have no problem destroying the economy of Ukraine if it can bump Biden's poll numbers by 4, 5, 10 points, whatever it is. Correct?
Correct. Can I just say, I've been trying repeatedly to figure out what this whole thing is all about, why the US is stirring up the story of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which the Ukrainians say has no basis, which the Germans, the French, and other Europeans also say has no basis. Why are we seeing this narrative being constructed in that kind of way? Well, I come up with various theories from time to time, but in the end, the only one that really seems to fit all the facts, and the default one, which I accept, is that it's all about bolstering the president's poll ratings. As I said, I come back to what David Stockman has written. David Stockman, who of course knows his way around Washington, he says it's a Wag the Dog 2, and that's exactly what it looks to be. And of course, this means, if that is right, and I'm sure it is, then Ukraine is being abused in the most extraordinary way because its economy is crumbling, its government is bewildered, and it's being pushed, in effect, into a conflict with Russia, which it has no interest in and no desire to become involved in order to work through the ambitions of certain political leaders in Washington. The president, the Democratic Party, and all the others. We have been saying repeatedly on these programs that the only way for the Democrats to extricate themselves from the political problems they have in Washington is to start a war somewhere. They seem to be trying to start it, and they're getting incredibly angry and very frustrated that the Ukrainians are not playing according to the narrative that the narrative makers in Washington are trying to impose on them.
Yeah, because their country's going to fall apart. But I mean, Ukraine gets treated like utter crap
Yeah.
by the collective West.
Yeah.
I mean, like utter crap
Yes.
by the collective West. And this goes back to the coup, to the Obama coup. The EU had their hand in it as well. This
Yeah.
goes back to Biden, Hunter
Yeah.
Biden, the SOB, fired the prosecutor. Remember Biden's line there? How come the press all of a sudden has forgotten all about that when they're talking about Ukraine and Putin? Now they're blaming it all on, once again, Putin wants to expand the Soviet empire. They're going back to that line as well, which is as if Russia needs more land. I mean, how come they forget all of a sudden, left and right, not only Democrats, also Republicans, all the Republicans,
Yes.
even Fox News, with the exception of Tucker Carlson, who's done a great job covering this, and Dr. Steve Turley, who's done a great job covering this. Everybody else has completely handled this story like utter crap. Alexander, why? Why did they all of a sudden forget about Hunter Biden, Burisma, Kerry's kids, Pelosi's kids, Romney's kids, the Obama coup? All of that stuff has been completely forgotten.
Absolutely correct. That's entirely right. It doesn't exist. It never happened. This is something that we don't talk about because, as far as we're concerned, it's not something we want to talk about anymore. And consider, here we see Biden talking about the Russians planning to pillage Kiev. Who has actually pillaged Kiev? Who actually descended on the country like a pack of vultures and walked off with everything they could take? Not the Russians. The Russians aren't in Ukraine. They aren't in Kiev. Other people are. Now, can I just say, obviously, we don't want to talk about that in the United States. We don't want to talk about in the collective West. We don't want to face these realities. But, I think that this crisis, this pseudo-crisis, ought to act as a wake-up call for the Ukrainians themselves. And when I talk about Ukrainians, I don't just mean, ordinary Ukrainians who have been passengers on this hideous ride and have never really had any particular part in it at any point and any word in it or say in it at any point. I'm talking about the Ukrainian elite. I'm talking about the oligarchs in Ukraine. They should take a step back and think about what the US is doing to their country and ultimately to them. If there is a war in between Ukraine and Russia, which is what all the indications now suggest is what some people in the US want. If there is such a war, Ukraine will be destroyed as a state. There will be no armed resistance to the Russians. There's been polling data about this now, which is, in my opinion, absolutely conclusive on this issue. But the oligarchs, the Ukrainian oligarchs, will lose all their wealth, and the Ukrainians will lose their country. And the Ukrainian elites will no longer be elites of a country anymore. So I think they need to wake up now and ask themselves, this country that they've aligned themselves to, the United States, is it really their friend, or is it actually their master, a master which is abusing them in its own interests and is prepared to cast them aside? Because, frankly, that's the kind of thing that the political elites in Washington are prepared to do in their constant game for power in Washington itself. So I think Ukrainian elites need to take a step back and revisit the policies that they've been following for all these years. I'm not sure that they will, but some of them, terrible, awful people that they are, nonetheless do strike me as being fairly clever. And perhaps this is the moment that they start using their brains and start thinking through the implications of what they've been leading their country into.
All right. So Biden says that Russia has amassed 100,000 troops at the border, and they are going to invade any minute now. They're going to sack Kiev, prepare for impact. He's yelling at Zelensky. Zelensky, who's in Ukraine, and the U.S. has all this intelligence, by the way. So they have all these satellites, and they can see everything that's going on the border. Zelensky, who is in Ukraine, in Kiev, is saying, our intelligence, we're here, we're on the ground. Russia's just right up there. Right up there and over there. We're not worried. There's no tanks in Kiev. He says it. There's no tanks in Kiev. There's no panic. Everything is fine. Please stop destroying our country. In essence, that's what he's saying. The economy of our country. I mean, they're even saying, people, come and visit us still. Don't just, stop traveling to Kiev either. This is destroying us. That's what Zelensky is saying. The Russians are not going to attack. Keep in mind, the Russians can move their military anywhere they want in their country. Anyway, Alexander, how come the U.S. just doesn't release all the satellite images and not just select little portions of it? I mean, everything, and just make their case and say, look, here are all the tanks. Here are the 10,000 freaking tanks. Here are the 100, 200, 300,000 Russians. Here's the border. Look at all of them. Look at how they're moving down south. Invasion is imminent. How come the U.S. just doesn't release all of that? They never did it for Syria. They never did it for Iraq, WMDs. No. They never did it for Libya. They always pull the same crap. How come they don't release it so we can, MH17, how come they don't release this so we can put this narrative to bed?
Because, of course, they know that the narrative is false. I mean, can I just say, when the United States needs to release satellite data and that kind of thing, well, it does it. I mean, they did it during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. For example, I mean, they presented the Security Council, the UN Security Council, with photos. They weren't actually satellite photos in those days, but they were photos taken by US reconnaissance planes showing where the Soviet missiles were in Cuba, kind of information that is normally classified. But the United States did not hesitate to publish it at that point, because that was a real crisis involving real missiles. But they don't want to publish all this information that they have, except, as you correctly say, for very carefully selected and very thoroughly cropped photos, which give completely the wrong impressions. They give the impressions of large numbers of tanks and lorries and things like that suddenly gathered together in fields, whereas in fact, if you actually see the entire image, which you can do it through Google Earth, what you discover is that these are permanent bases. There's large barracks there. Those tanks and vehicles are permanently stationed in these places. They haven't been rushed to these places in preparation for some kind of offensive. Anyway, apart from these very selective and very cropped photos, they're not publishing material because they know that it would contradict their story.
Okay, final question. Bulgaria said, we don't want a part of this.
No.
Croatia said, we don't want a part of this. Hungary has come out now and said, and actually I think Ben Wallace is in Hungary today. I think he's actually in Budapest meeting with the defense minister either today or yesterday, and he's trying to pressure Hungary to start letting forces come in. And the Hungarian government said, look, we don't need this. Not only do we not need this, but Orban is going to meet with Putin. They're going to talk about things. But what did Orban say? Yeah, we're going to talk about all this stuff. But Orban said, first and foremost, we need to secure good prices on energy. I mean, this is logical stuff. Now they're branding Orban once again as a Putin puppet. And he's going against the NATO alliance, and Russia's going to invade Ukraine, and NATO and Hungary's helping him. This is pure madness. But I mean, what do you make of this? Here you have a rational leader in Hungary who is saying, guys, stop. Let's focus on what's important.
Well, it is absolutely correct. And can I just say, of course, where Orban leads, others have a tendency to follow. And there's a very important potential leader, Friedrich Merz, who is now the elected head of the CDU party, which is still Germany's, big party, traditional governing party. He's very likely to be Chancellor of Germany very soon. He says many of these sanctions proposals that are being floated, like cutting off Russia from SWIFT, are madness. We need Russian gas. And perhaps most extraordinary of all, he said that the EU association agreement with Ukraine was a disastrous mistake. He's actually come out and said that. So, I mean, we are seeing more and more people pushing back against the narrative. And they say, look, this isn't real. This is putting the whole economic position of Europe in jeopardy. All this talk about alternative gas supplies is so much bullshit. You're not going to be able to provide them. The cost would be absolutely off the scale. It would cause energy prices in Europe to skyrocket. This simply isn't real. And what happens then is that, of course, all the narrative creators, the people who are agitating to start this conflict or pseudo-conflict or fantasy conflict, instead of backing off, they become more and more angry. We see the British, sending their people across Eastern Europe, offering to send their troops to Estonia, threatening to sanction, Putin's inner circle in London, people who have already been sanctioned. You see all of that. You have Biden, as we said, rowing with Zelensky. We have vicious media campaigns against the Hungarians, of course, but the Germans also. We see all of this. Instead of backing off, instead of accepting that this has no reality and realizing that this isn't working, what we see is that the people who are running this are getting ever more angry and ever more bullying. And they will continue to until that point finally comes when some leader from one of the big EU states, one of the big European states, actually stands up and says enough. It might be, say, Friedrich Merz one day, or perhaps President Le Pen, or someone like that. But someone needs eventually to tell these people publicly, not in private conversations. But they have to say, finally, this is our continent, this is our region, this is our peace, this is our economy. You're disrupting it all. This is no reality. It makes absolutely no sense. Enough's enough. Go away. Leave us alone. This is our region. We have to make the best of it. Now, perhaps, hopefully, one day that will happen. At the moment, I have to say this, Olaf Scholz keeps quiet because he's scared, clearly, of antagonizing the Americans. Macron comes up with all these clever, elegant proposals and plans. His skepticism is completely clear, but he isn't able to articulate it. Not in a simple terms, like I've said. Mario Draghi in Italy, well, is exactly the same. He's been angling to become president of Italy. That hasn't worked. He's still prime minister, but he doesn't want to go against his globalist masters either. So none of these leaders today are prepared to do what de Gaulle used to do, what someone like Willy Brandt or Helmut Schmidt might also have done, which is to say to these people, to the Blinkens and the Newlands and all the rest, the Wallaces, the Liz Trusses, enough's enough. Put a sock in it, go away. This is our region. These are our economies. We can't have these ridiculous games being played out all the time. And if that happens, that will transform the atmosphere in Europe. But for the moment, the only person who's able to stand up and say that is someone like Orban. And of course, we've had people now like the president of Croatia, the Bulgarian government. But these are relatively small countries. Hungary punches above its weight, but it's still a small country. These are relatively small countries, and they have only so much weight. It needs the EU's, Europe's heavy hitters finally to come out and to speak straightforwardly instead of through forked tongues.
Do you think Zelensky's going to survive? Zelensky, you think they're going to...
Well, now there's lots of talk of a coup, and this is appearing in all kinds of places. And by the way, simultaneously. So there's lots and lots of talk of a possible coup. I'm going to say this straight away. I can well believe that there are people in Washington who are now incredibly angry with Zelensky. And given what sort of people we're talking about, I'm absolutely willing to believe that the people in Washington are now working with Zelensky's opponents on the ground with a view to ousting him. There's now credible reports that it was the US Embassy, for example, that intervened to make sure that the arrest warrant on Poroshenko was not executed, but was quashed by a court. All I would say is the situation in Ukraine is incredibly fragile. Launching a coup against the president of Ukraine is much more likely to lead to the collapse of Ukraine's political system than it is to replace an unsatisfactory president, which is to say Zelensky, with a more pliable and reliable one, which presumably would be Poroshenko. It would trigger a political crisis. I can easily imagine, for example, mass desertions from the Ukrainian army, which is anyway apparently finding it difficult to recruit people. And the polling data, of which there's now been increasing amounts from Ukraine, is absolutely terrible. Put aside all this nonsense you're hearing about Ukrainians being ready to take up arms to fight the Russian invaders. The truth, as the real opinion polls show, is almost the diametric opposite. They suggest a deeply disillusioned, deeply cynical population. And for them, for many of them, I strongly suspect that a forcible change of power in Kiev would be the point where they finally say enough.
Yeah, yeah. Tell what you just said to all the super smart mainstream media analysts, except for, once again, Tucker Carlson's got it right, Dr. Steve Turley's got it right. I can't follow everybody, but from who I follow, those two have done a great job in covering this. Everyone else has actually said exactly what you said. They actually believe that the Ukrainians are going to pick up arms and actually fight the Russians as they sweep through their country. This whole thing is, you said, it's a complete glamour war. Everyone's living in a movie, in a cinema. And of course, the main narrative is Putin wants to do this because he wants to expand the Russian territory back to the glory days of the Soviet Empire. Actually, Alexander, I heard that Putin actually doesn't want to remake the Soviet Empire. He wants to remake the Byzantine Empire. And after Ukraine, he's coming for Greece.
Why stop at the Byzantine Empire? Why not the Roman Empire? Why not go all the way back to the Roman Empire? I mean, this is absolutely crazy stuff. It's ludicrous stuff. And, I was provided by a third party, which I'm afraid I'm not able to identify him, but it's a real opinion poll data from Ukraine carried out by the Kiev Institute of Sociology or whatever, and it showed how deeply cynical and disillusioned and basically war weary the population of Ukraine has become. And one of the most interesting things that came across as a result of that poll is that the demographic which in any armed resistance would have to play the biggest role for that resistance to be effective, which is the 18 to 29-year-old demographic. They are the most anti-war. They are the least willing, apart from the 70-year-olds and up, to actually fight for Ukraine. There is no enthusiasm, saying this, on the part of any part of the age demographics in Ukraine to fight for Ukraine in the kind of way that the media is saying. But amongst the 18 to 29-year-olds, this is the group that, there's fiery, passionate young men and women full of ardor and physical energy, the sort that, enlists it in armies and in revolutionary groups and insurgencies. There's no enthusiasm for war amongst them at all. Less than there is, for example, in the age group in the 40s, the age group who are in the 40s. And they're not particularly enthusiastic about fighting for Ukraine either. People are talking about a country that does not exist. It's just as this conflict, this crisis is a narrative construct, so this Ukraine, which people are prepared to die for, is a media construct as well.
Yeah. Just a final thought as we wrap up the video. If they do remove Zelensky, then I really think Ukraine is done. All bets are off.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think Ukraine may really be finished.
Absolutely. I mean, I could very easily see how it could cause the entire house of cards to collapse. I did a program for my channel in which I said it would be like the ouster which the Kennedy administration was involved in, of President Diem in Vietnam, in Saigon, in the early 1960s, and I think it was 1963. The result of that, because, you know, the Americans had some issues with Diem, just as they now have with Zelensky. So they removed Diem, and the result was Vietnam collapsed, and the only way to sustain South Vietnam was to send American troops in. 500,000 of them at one point. So, I mean, you know, just which kept the whole thing going, but at the cost of American treasure and American blood. Well, that wouldn't be available in Ukraine this time, certainly not against the Russians. And anybody who thinks that the US is going to send troops to Ukraine to fight the Russians is living in fantasy land, actually, can I just say? And if anybody in Washington has that idea, they should just look at the opinion polls there and the sentiments that most Americans have about this. So, putting all that aside, if they do that, if they knock Zelensky out, if they overthrow Zelensky, well, believe me, the whole thing could just implode, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it did. As I said, if the army began, the soldiers in the army who've been told that if there was a war with Russia, they would all be defeated within hours. They've been told that by their own generals. If they see Zelensky, who's trying to keep them out of a war, being overthrown in another coup, and a new leader, basically appointed by the Americans, orders them to attack and die, because that's what it would amount to. I can easily see mass desertions across the Ukrainian military. I could see many of the regions in Ukraine, many of the towns starting to, unrest restarting. I could see many of the oligarchs extremely unhappy about a war and the prospects of something that could, collapse. I mean, it's entirely possible that the whole thing could unwind. So it will be a disastrous mistake. It would be an act of pure folly. But given that, as we discussed, there are some people in Washington who think in those terms, and there are more who are deluded and fooled by this fantasy picture of a Ukraine yearning to defend itself, well, I'm afraid the possibility of a coup is not impossible at all.
Yeah, boy, the Biden White House really screwed this one up big time. All right.
Oh, as they're doing everything else. I read an article today in the British media. I think it was the Telegraph, which basically said that Biden is the worst president ever. Which is quite a thought.
That. And he's only 1 year in. That's the scary part of all of this. Yeah. Okay. The Duran.locals.com. ODYSEE, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U is where you will find us, and Duran Shop. Good day is the code. That is the magic mug. 10,000 geopolitical IQ points is what you will add when you drink from that mug. You will find it on the Duran Shop, 10% off. Everything, all merchandise. Take care.